All right, so we're still in this book, and we're still in part two, the theory of aggression, wrapping things up, getting there at least. Still in chapter 6, interventions, the second video. All right, so here I just want to make a couple comments, just a quick little overview of the sort of the conclusion of the chapter, if you will, and that is at the state level we have three basic cases for suspending P. Remember, P was that principle that came out of the legalist paradigm that said never intervene, and then we looked kind of in the basement concepts that support that paradigm, which said something along the lines of well, you know, we can make some exceptions, but we got to justify them. And in that case, we get these three places where we can modify our legalist paradigm. So 1, 2, and 3, just to keep track, those are modifications 2, 3, and 4 to that legalist paradigm. All right, so the first one is secession, when there's a struggle for independence. And if you look, basically, that's when a particular set of boundaries clearly contains two or more political communities. Political communities is important. One of which is clearly engaged in a large-scale military struggle for independence. That is when what is at issue is secession or national liberation. And the second one is a counter-intervention when the boundaries have already been crossed by the armies of a foreign power, even if the crossing has been called by one of the parties in a civil war. That is when what is at issue is counter-intervention. And then the last one, humanitarian intervention, when the violation of human rights within a set of boundaries is so terrible, that's basically, it's shocking the conscience of fellow nations, and makes, and, you know, basically atrocities. You're in the land, you're in the area where people are committing atrocities. So these then open up the way for just wars to be fought, and these are just wars that are not fought in self-defense or against aggression in the strict sense. Now, Walzer then, right at the end of the chapter, the last paragraph, he said the second, third, and fourth revisions of the paradigm have this form. States can be invaded and wars justly begun to assist secessionist movements once the secessionist movement has demonstrated its representative character. So, you know, there are all kinds of conditions here. Once it's demonstrated its representative character, okay? And then this also to balance, number 2, to balance the prior interventions of other powers, and finally to rescue people that are threatened with massacre. In each of these cases, we permit, or after the fact, we don't condemn the violation, right, of the formal rules of sovereignty, which is what an intervention always is. It is a violation of state sovereignty, but we don't condemn it in these kinds of cases. And the formula is, again, why do we sort of permit this? Well, because they uphold the values of individual life and communal liberty, of which sovereignty is itself an expression. So when the sovereignty of a state, right, is basically kind of it's an expression of a certain way of life, but the state might be either doing it to itself or something is threatening that very way of life, well, then it's not really a true expression of sovereignty anymore. So we tend to say, well, under those conditions, that state would lose its right to not be invaded or have its internal affairs messed around with. So it would lose this property or this principle P. But again, as if you look at Walzer's discussions of all, you know, particular instances of each of these when they happen, they're all governed by constraints. It's not you can go in there, oh yeah, like once it's met that something like this is going on or this that you can just go in and do anything you want as the intervening state. No, there's constraints all over the place, and so these constraints have to be included in our thinking about this. Now, sometimes people argue that constraints are often ignored in interventions, so maybe we should just insist on an absolute rule of non-intervention, right? Because if you allow interventions with constraints, well, the whole thing, you know, people are going to ignore the constraints, so why not just ban interventions? So in other words, have an absolute rule. But the absolute rule will have to be ignored as will also that'll be ignored too. So if you think certain conventions of constraints will be ignored, well, why not? Why wouldn't it be reasonable to assume that the whole thing will be ignored? So, and Walzer said the absolute rule will also be ignored, and then we have no standards to judge what happens next. In fact, we do have such standards as he's tried to map out in this chapter. These standards reflect deep and valuable, though they're deep and valuable ideas, though in their applications difficult and problematic commitments ultimately to human rights. So underlying all this is a notion of human rights. So when states are violating human rights, yeah, then and basically you can think of it that way. That although Walzer hasn't really specified in detail what he means by human rights, but it is acknowledging that we have certain kinds of human rights, and they are universal, so that states can intervene in other states that are violating, or when those violations are occurring of human rights, then interventions are justifiable. But again, still with constraints. See you next video.